Hello and welcome once again to the Justin Center Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. I just want to give you a reminder, as always, that Just and Center as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that if you have benefited from the work that we do as an organization, the educational materials that we produce, that you would consider becoming a contributor. You can go to justincenter.org and go to our donate page and help us out there. We have actually recently just revised our whole website. We have a brand new website. And so we'd love to hear your feedback on that, as we're still kind of putting some things on there and putting the pieces together and trying to make it as valuable for you as possible. So if there's anything you'd like to see on there you're not seeing, please do let us know. You can also sign up for our newsletter. That would be helpful for us in growing our newsletter, but it would also hopefully be helpful for you because we do send out things like discounts or special deals, and we'll be doing some more of that in the future. All right, so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what I have done and generally done in the past, and that is that we're going to be spending some time talking about how to engage in argument and how to engage in rational argument and to do it well, how to analyze somebody else's argument, how not to make an argument. What has really precipitated this in my own mind, leading to producing something like this, is really just watching the ways that people discuss ideas on the internet as a whole. And it probably shouldn't be surprising, just due to the nature of the platform, that it is rare to encounter a discussion on issues, and whether that's theological or political or cultural or whatever else it might be. But it's difficult to encounter, it's uncommon to encounter a disputation of some kind between people online where there are really rational principles at work at all. There's a lot of speaking past one another when things happen online. So what I'm hoping that this is going to do is it's going to provide a basic framework for how it is that we are to engage with somebody else's argument. Now, I'm dealing with this within the realm of theology because that's my field. However, these things can be applied broadly across the board. So you don't have to be that engaged in the field of theology at all, really, to understand what I'm talking about here. I did initially think about doing this through analyzing a talk or analyzing an article and pointing out ways that perhaps there are logical fallacies that are used, or there is speaking past an issue, those kind of things. But I didn't want to just put somebody's talk or article on blast and go after it in this kind of way. So I decided not to do that. So I will just be providing some examples throughout of all of the kind of pieces that I'm working on here. Now, these type of things are helpful, certainly not just in social media. Social media discourse is generally going to be fruitless anyway, so it's probably not worth engaging in very much. But it's going to be helpful in school, if you're writing papers, if you're having a discussion with somebody about an issue, whatever it is that you're doing. These things really are very helpful in a number of different fields if you ever have disagreements with people and express those things, whether in speech or in writing. All right, so I want to first just start here by talking a little bit about classical rhetoric. Now, we're not going to be looking at rhetoric per se here throughout this talk, but I do think that it is important to have some basic context or understanding of the different elements of rhetoric and of persuasion before we start delving into how to evaluate an argument. Because it really helps not just to form your own persuasive arguments, which is the primary purpose of rhetoric, but if you are dealing with, say, a critique and you want to critique something that somebody is saying, these general principles and divisions, this threefold division of arguments here, what is called the rhetorical triangle, helps you to also identify what someone else is doing when they are making an argument. And it teaches you how to kind of pull apart these different pieces and to say, okay, what is an actual logical argument here versus that which is, say, appealing just to the emotions. And the point of this division is not to say that it's purposeless to appeal to the emotions, but this does help us to say, okay, well, that's an emotional appeal that doesn't necessarily necessitate, logical necessity, per se. So this is what's often called the rhetorical triangle, and this is most famously portrayed in Aristotle. And so we have these three different elements of rhetoric, of persuasive argument. And so The first of these, as we're talking about logic, is logos. This is the logic, the reason. And so in any kind of talk you're giving that's going to be persuasive, you want to have some kind of logic, some kind of rational argument that actually is compelling. But a logical argument by itself does not necessarily make an idea compelling. The fact is that people are not logic machines. We are not computers that just process data. People are often persuaded, really, in some ways, I think probably more often persuaded by non-rational arguments. People are often persuaded by things that appeal to their experience or, their emotions or something else. And so even if you might want people to be logic machines, you might want to just engage in the realm of the mind or what is rational. The reality is that most people just don't function in that way, and you have to move beyond that. And this is true of all of us to some degree. Now, people are obviously formed very differently. So some people are probably more driven by, emotional appeals than others are. But we all have these different elements of our constitution, of our psychology. Okay. So the evaluation of somebody else's argument, if we're going to look at an argument, look at, say, a talk that's persuasive, must include a right understanding of how each of these elements play into an argument. So we've talked about logic already, but then we have pathos. A pathos is an appeal to emotions. And this is part of any persuasive argument. Unless you're an analytic philosopher or something, which most people are not, you're probably not going to just find logical arguments by themselves that compelling. People are often stirred by their emotions, their feelings, their affections when you hear a good talk. And so people are often going to, say, remember a talk more when their emotions have been appealed to some degree. And you see this especially, say, in political discussions. There is a reason why political pundits, by and large, and this is true across the board, tend to engage in very strong rhetorical arguments that make you upset or angry or feel attacked or feel like the world is going to end if you don't, join up with this or that cause. And all of that comes down to pathos, is that there is an attempt to try to grab onto your feelings of, anger or fear and to inflame those so that you will listen to that person's argument or their position. Okay, then there is ethos, and this has to do with somebody's credibility. And so this is something that people do to establish that they are somebody that should be listened to. They actually have an expertise in the field that they're speaking to. They actually have some kind of experience with whatever it is that they're speaking to. And so this, for example, this happens a lot in the writings of the New Testament. St. Paul does this a lot when he appeals to his apostolic authority. And he's giving those who are reading his letters a statement about his credibility, to say he's not just a random guy with opinions, right? He's actually been called as an apostle. He has a position of authority, so he's able to speak to these things very directly. Or Paul does this when he even appeals to his past as a Pharisee, to say, like, I understand the Pharisees. I was the Pharisee of Pharisees. I was one of them too, so I understand it. And so the New Testament, especially Paul, uses all three of these elements of rhetoric. Paul is clearly he's schooled in classical rhetoric, and you can pick apart all of this within St. Paul's writings. There's actually been, in more recent years, more attention paid to St. Paul's use of classical rhetoric in his letters. So all of these, again, this isn't to say that they're bad. So what we're not saying is logic is good, pathos, ethos, these are bad. No, but the pathos and ethos by themselves do not constitute a logical argument. But if you are going to be persuasive to other people, you want to use all of these elements. Sometimes there is a fourth element that's been added that some people appeal to, which is something called kairos. And this idea of kairos signifies a particular time or a season in which a particular argument or way of speaking may resonate. So you could think of this, for example, in like some of the most persuasive world leaders in one way or another. Now, before I give you an example, I am not saying that this is a good person or a good thing. This is the thing we're going to be talking about next. There's a difference between a fact judgment and a value judgment. But Adolf Hitler was very good at doing this, right? He was a very persuasive rhetorician. There was a reason why he came into power. And it was really that kairos element that he really grabbed onto, that he was in the right place at the right time and knew how to talk to people in that particular season or time to convince them of his ideas. Or you could think of all sorts of examples. Martin Luther King Jr. would be an example of this as well. And again, I'm not equating the two figures, and that's something we're going to talk about here, is because when you use examples, people often have the inability to distinguish between something being judged as valuable or something being judged as fact. So we'll move on to the next part. So let's talk about that then. Distinguishing between value judgments and factual judgments. This is something that I encounter all the time on social media, and it's one of the most frustrating things about social media is that if you're somebody that's trying to make an actual just factual claim, like I just did, right? I just brought up the fact that, yes, Hitler was a very bad guy and did a lot of very bad things. But if I'm pointing out that he knew his rhetoric very well and was effective as a rhetorician, the place where people often jump to is, you're saying that he was right. Like, no, of course not. That's a completely different kind of claim, right? So people often jump to, you mentioned this, therefore this is good. Or you made a claim about history, therefore you think that's good. These are not the same kinds of things. So we need to be able to distinguish these things in the way that we are talking. So defining what is the case is a factual judgment, or what has been the case if you're making a historical claim. This does not in itself provide a valuation of whether such a thing should be the case, or whether such a thing is good. It is not a value judgment. Making the case, so here's an example of this, and I have examples throughout of these principles. Making the case that a, say, revered historical figure held to a particular view does not necessarily imply a value judgment on that view. So if you were to here's an example, because this is something that I've encountered when I've made this claim, and that is that Martin Luther, the founder of the Lutheran Church, and I'm a Lutheran pastor, so there's certain weight in saying that Martin Luther said something. But Martin Luther had certain views of the way that ownership works in the state that really do not accord at all with how we tend to think about ownership and private property in our world. And when I've made that claim, people kind of jump at that. And I've done this in several different venues. And people always jump at that and say, wait, are you saying that that's right? That we shouldn't have our current view of private property because of this? And I'm really not saying that, actually. It makes sense why someone maybe would assume that, because I'm a Lutheran and he has a certain kind of respect, of course, within the Lutheran tradition. But it's actually not the claim that I'm making at all. So don't just jump from assuming a value judgment from a factual judgment. Like, maybe I am bringing that up because I want to go defend it. But that's not necessarily the case. So if you are looking at somebody making a factual judgment, make sure that they are making a value judgment as well along with that before you jump on it, because we often miss this. Okay, now if we're talking about value judgments, we do have to also distinguish between different kinds of value judgments. Now, there are different philosophies of value judgments, and some would argue that every value judgment is purely subjective. Right, so the subjective value judgment is one that is really a personal judgment. It's a judgment about taste or personal pleasure. And so this kind of value judgment would just be nothing mere than subjective opinion. So you might say, well, I enjoy the taste of this particular food. Or I don't, right? I don't like olives. I really hate olives. And I just don't like the taste of them. And if I say I really don't like olives, I'm not making a claim about the objective goodness of olives in one way or another. I'm just saying that personally, I really don't like them. I don't enjoy the taste. So that is a value judgment to some degree, but it's a subjective one. So I'm just saying the value that it has for me. Some philosophies would say there are only subjective value judgments. If there are only subjective value judgments, then you can't really have debates about value judgments in any real sense. Because if you don't have any actual standards by which value judgments could be right or wrong, everybody just has an opinion, and so you're just kind of sharing opinions. But if you believe that there are objective value judgments, you are saying that you're making judgments or claims about universal standards or value, and that makes them open to debate. So, for example, if you're going to make the claim that say the movie The Room by Tommy Wiseau is a bad movie. I mean, that seems objectively valid. But you can only really make that claim or have an argument about it if somebody would want to defend the other position, which I don't know why they would. But if somebody does, then you can only engage with that if you have an objective standard by which there is a good movie versus a bad movie. Like, you've got to have some standard. You can't really have a debate. And so a debate about subjective value judgments will never get anywhere, because you're just saying, well, I like something. Well, I like that. Well, I don't like it. Well, I like, okay, that you're not going to get anywhere there. So at that point, subjective value judgments aren't really open to debate. But if you're going to debate like a factual judgment and a value judgment or a value judgment, we need to be able to distinguish those things clearly. So you need to be able to differentiate between those two to do it well, and evaluate which kind of judgment you're looking at here. Okay. Let's talk about defining terms. This is really important because, again, I see this constantly, that people are engage in debate, especially in social media, because everybody's got their own little spheres, right? Unlike social media, you've got your own little circles. You've got your circles of people that talk about the things that you talk about. So I'm in the world of theology, and that means that any like spaces I'm on, if you can call online spaces, but another issue. But if you do that, right, like there are assumed definitions of certain ideas or terms, or a certain context in which things are understood within a particular social group. But there are other social groups that have their own ways of communicating and speaking. And so what I say here is that linguistic signs can have distinct reference, especially when used within distinct social groups or intellectual spheres. So if you are using language that is speaking, say, to one field of study or one kind of circle of ideas, and it is used so publicly that people from another kind of sphere or circle of ideas that have very different concerns here, it is easy for them to respond to you or to say something against what you're saying or even agree with what you're saying without really understanding what you're saying, because they're coming from a different perspective and they use words differently and they think in different questions. So here's just an example. And this is an example I found pretty regularly because this relates to both theology and philosophy, which are always interrelated fields. And that is free will. And so the question of free will is a very different question, and it has a very different definition depending on who you're talking to. So if you're talking about, say, the field of cognitive science or the field of the philosophy of mind, and those two things interact with one another, I wish cognitive science interacted with philosophy of mind more, but they do, to some degree at least, interact with one another. And when you're talking about free will in that particular context, you're talking about things like biological necessity, the mechanisms of the brain, and whether or not everything that you do is biologically determined by a kind of series of neuron firings in the brain that are just kind of inevitable, that one could not even theoretically really make a decision against because those things control your behavior. And so when people are talking about free will in those debates or those contexts, that's what they're thinking about. Now, in a theological sphere, there are a lot of debates about free will as well, but often those debates have to do with the question of spiritual freedom. And we're talking about whether in a state of sin, humanity has the freedom apart from grace to come to faith, or if the Holy Spirit needs to open up the heart, give the gift of faith in order for one to believe. These two things are completely, really disconnected ideas. The debates are totally different. The terms are totally different. And so if you're going to hear one, debate and then bring this discussion into another debate, you're just going to be totally confused. So you have to define what it is you're talking about before you start to say, well, that's not right, or this is right. Say, okay, what do they mean by the terms that they're using? Because oftentimes they're saying something very different. This can even happen within the same field as that field develops historically. So, for example, like what an a priori judgment is before Kant has a bit of a different definition than it does after Kant. And so even if you're reading philosophical sources prior to Kant, you've got to ask that question, what do they mean by the term, without assuming the later definition? So you got to always define terms. That's always the most important thing you're doing when you're having a discussion or maybe a disagreement, is say, okay, what are we talking about here? I have a second example here, and that is the way that Aristotle uses the term cause and causality versus the way that later Newtonian scientific perspective on causes is discussed. When Aristotle, for example, uses the language of causes, he has all these different kinds of causes. There is a final cause, which is the goal of a thing. You've got your formal material cause. And I'm not going to explain what all of these mean here, but this is an example where oftentimes those who are in scientific fields dismiss what happens in philosophy, or at least especially in classical philosophy, because what they're assuming is a particular definition of causality, which is scientific causality in a particular field, which is distinct from a kind of metaphysical discussion of causality. That's not to say they're not related, but they're not the same thing. And so oftentimes scientists might read, say, something like Thomas Aquinas's Five Proofs for the Existence of God and assume a more Newtonian view of causes when they're reading Aquinas, and therefore miss his entire argument. So we've got to define the terms. That's a good example because this happens a lot in some of these conversations. And this is generally true if you read people like Richard Dawkins or those who were involved in what was that new atheist movement, 20 years ago now, is that scientists often have very different uses of terms than theologians and philosophers. And so there's a lot of wrong assumptions about how things are to be defined, which leads to a lot of talking past each other. Okay, so it is important then, in light of this, to identify the discourse into which someone is speaking before you engage in critique. Find out what it is that they're talking about before you start to jump in and assume that they're talking about something that's relevant to the discourse that you're engaged in, which maybe has similar terms. So I have an example here, and this is one that happened to me, and this was the weirdest. I've had a lot of weird experiences on social media, and generally I try to avoid it mostly now anyway, but at one time, so I was in this was a discussion about Christocentric hermeneutical principles within a Christian context, right? So we're talking about the question of how is it that Christians read the Old Testament. And from the Lutheran perspective, which is where I'm coming from, we have a very Christocentric way of reading the Old Testament. In other words, we believe that Jesus is at the center of both Testaments, and we read the Old and New Testament through the lens of Christ. He's kind of the hermeneutical key, the key to which we need to understand what the Testaments mean. And there was a discussion or point I was making with somebody coming from a more dispensational approach who has a very different view of how the Old Testament is to be understood. And something that I said was somehow found by somebody who was Jewish, and what I had said was read into some kind of anti-Jewish polemic. And they retweeted this, and then this blew up, and I had all of these very angry people yelling at me. And I was so confused because I was like, what is happening? What? I don't even know what you're talking about. There were all these weird assumptions about what I was saying that had nothing to do with what I was saying. And the reason is because they had a totally different discourse, and they assumed that what I was saying was speaking to them in their discourse, and it not that it wasn't relevant to that discourse. Obviously, how we interpret the Old Testament is kind of relevant, but it wasn't directly engaging with them at all, and that wasn't even what I was speaking to. So this kind of thing happens a lot online. That was the worst I've ever experienced it. I've also experienced it actually in places, and this has happened more than once, where I'm making a point, and I'm actually critiquing one particular side of the aisle on politics or culture, whatever, and somebody from that side thinks I'm critiquing something else from the side that I was actually supporting on whatever particular point this was, and then goes after me. So totally misunderstanding the point. This kind of thing happens all the time. So before you just jump to respond, this is probably the problem with social media with all of this, is there's never an examination. There's never what do you mean by that? And usually in discussions, that should literally be the first question you ask. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? If you're talking, say, for example, if you're talking to somebody who says that they are a feminist, say, and I'm not trying to talk about social political issues. I'm just giving examples of things people debate all the time. If somebody says they're a feminist, well, then somebody else could just say, well, I'm not. And and then make all these assumptions about what they mean by that. And this could happen on the other side too. So this happens all the time on both sides. Well, that's like a term that is so amorphous. It means so many things to so many people, and for a lot of people, it doesn't really mean anything. So you have to ask the question, well, what do you mean by that? How are you defining that term? What is it that you are identifying when you use that label? Sometimes people don't even know what the heck they mean when they use a label. So it's always important to be like, to just start there and say, okay, let's actually define what you're talking about. What point are you trying to make? And then when you get there, you say, okay, now we can start a discussion about this. But always ask for definitions first. And the terms like liberal and conservative are the same way. People have very different definitions of what those things mean. So again, say, what does that mean to you? When you use that label, what are you trying to identify? And that's also just very helpful in discussion in general, because what it's going to show is that you're interested in listening to what the person's ideas actually are. And it actually helps bring their guard down if you're going to have a productive discussion or debate. Instead of just jumping at them about something that you disagree with, saying like, okay, what do you mean? Then they feel like they're kind of heard and you're asking some questions to try to understand where they're actually coming from. And then they're going to be a heck of a lot more open to actually listening to what you might have to say instead of just jumping into attack mode instantly, which doesn't help anything except your own self-righteousness. All right. So always ask for definitions if something is not clear in what someone is saying. Don't assume a definition unless that definition is obviously apparent. So you don't have to, ask for definitions of like, what do you mean by the, So you don't have to ask for things that are kind of obvious. But when you are dealing with particular terms that are perhaps the key to a disagreement with somebody, or what you think is a disagreement, then you really want to try to make sure that you're understanding them correctly. So obviously there are particular times where it's apparent the definitions that they're using, but oftentimes it's not. So it's always good to ask. Even if it is apparent, it's not going to hurt anything if you just ask somebody to define it, to just get some clarity on what they're trying to say. Okay, so I've talked about this between kind of different social groups or different intellectual fields, scientists versus philosophers versus theologians versus field of literature, whatever. We're often using similar terms that mean very different things by them. But also, even within the same social group or context, sometimes, depending on the context, certain terms have different connotations. They connote different things. They identify different things or ideas. Just as one example, in the New Testament, even just in the book of Romans, St. Paul uses the term nomos, the word for law, to refer to probably three different things, but at least two. And that is, sometimes he means this to refer to the moral commands of God, God's demands, things like the Ten Commandments. But also sometimes he uses them to refer to the 5 books of Moses, which is identified as the law. That's just one example, but we do this in our speech all the time. We have all sorts of words that we use, depending on the context, to refer to different things. So we have to be aware of the context, again, before jumping into a conversation. So, for example, I've used the term free will to refer to very different things, as talking about the discussions before. And so if I'm talking about the issue of what we call the bondage of the will, which is spiritual freedom, I'll use the term free will in a very different sense than I will if I'm talking about the philosophical issues. Because these, again, are just, the phrase is the same, but it means two totally different kinds of things. Not that they're not related in any sense, but they're not precisely identical. So one can have a very strong view of freedom in the philosophical sense, but also a very strong view of human bondage and a lack of freedom in a spiritual sense. Those two things can go hand in hand, and I think they should, but that's a question for another time. Okay, example 2 that I have here. People might support a position saying, for example, and here's just one of these terms that people throw around all the time, that is, say, I believe in equality, right? So I support equality. Well, what the heck does that mean? And people use this all the time. There was a recent talk that I engaged where somebody spoke against equality. And again, what do you mean by that? Because you've got to be so precise. This is a term that we all use all the time, and we just throw out and just assume a definition. But there are all sorts of different kinds of equality, so you have to be precise. What kind of equality are you talking about? If you say you believe in equality, okay, what kind of equality? So here are just some different ways of expressing what that might mean. For example, there's a distinction between the equality of opportunity versus the equality of outcome. So an example of this might be equality of opportunity, say, within first wave feminism or precursors to first wave feminism. So John Stuart Mill, on his essay on the liberation of women, he makes the argument that women should have all of the same opportunities as men. And so we should open up educational opportunities, open up the job market in the way that like women could do whatever kind of whatever jobs they want. And Mill's argument is that, well, we should just kind of let things take their course. So just give the women opportunities. They might do very different things. They might end up in very different lifestyles, have very different jobs. They might not want to work. Like whatever they choose to do, we should give them the opportunities so that they can take advantage of the opportunities. That's very different from a view that would talk about, women's roles in society. It would talk about equality of outcome. There, you're moving beyond saying we need to have equal opportunities. There, you're saying we need to make sure that we have programs that specifically get more women into fields that are male dominated, say of engineering or something else. And so there, you're talking about something very different. So you're talking about the outcomes being equal versus the opportunity being equal. Two very different kinds of proposals. And again, I'm not making any claims about what's right or wrong in any of these things. These are just examples. Okay. Second is ontological equality versus hierarchical equality. So you might say that all people are equal in the sense that there is an equal dignity that all people have. We are equally valuable. We're equally human. But that doesn't mean that we have absolute hierarchical equality. In other words, society must have some people that are leaders, and there are some people that are not. And so that we have a basic equality in terms of our value, we don't all have an equal function in society. Then we have, say, a theological equality versus some kind of social equality in one form or another. Theological equality is going to say that we are justified, we are righteous before God in the same way. We are equally loved by God. We are equally forgiven by God. We are equally redeemed by the blood of Christ. That's a theological equality. And that might not necessarily mean that there is absolute equality in social spheres. So we have to distinguish between those two things. And there's a question of, is the theological equality relevant to social equality? Does it relate to them? And if it does relate, how does it relate? Then we have another kind of equality. If we're talking about, say, the issue of rights, which is something else that's too often just thrown out there and not really defined. So if you say we have equal rights, well, what do you mean by equal rights? So there is a difference, for example, between inequality in innate rights versus acquired rights, right? So equality in innate rights, we're talking about things that are inherent to human dignity or personhood. This would be things like the right to life. I mean, that's kind of the primary one. So we might have equality in terms of right to life, say right to own property, whatever things you want to put in that category. But you might then say that doesn't mean that we have the right to all of what are acquired rights. The acquired rights being things that are to some degree historically and socially dependent. They're not inherent to the human nature as such. For example, like you don't have an innate right. And again, I'm not going to argue about this, but so you don't have an innate right in this view to, say, have somebody else's inheritance. You don't have an innate right just by nature that everyone who dies kind of shares their equal inheritance, and it's given in this, the same amount is given to all people. So being the child of a parent who has an inheritance that they have left for you, that's an acquired right. It's not something that is inherent to your nature as such. And there might be an inequality there because, of course, some people don't have any money to save and don't have inheritance to give, and some people do. So you just have to distinguish between all these various things before you can get into an actually productive conversation. So I'm going to move then into some common errors in reasoning and logic. So I'll talk about some logical fallacies that people engage in. Now, I'm going to focus particularly on ones that I see the most often today. So this doesn't mean that this isn't every logical fallacy I'm covering here, and this doesn't mean that the ones that I don't spend as much time on aren't important, but these are just the ones that I tend to see the most in discussions today. The first is what people often call whataboutism. Now, obviously, that's not a classical term, but it is one that seems to define how so many conversations on the internet go, and that is when you deflect from a point by bringing up something totally unrelated. Like where somebody's making a point, say, for their political position, and then someone from the other side says, but what about this thing that your side does, and that's bad? Well, it's not relevant to the question, because whether one side is right about one particular issue has nothing to do with whether that side is right on some other issue. They might be completely wrong on one issue and totally right on another issue. So that's just a way to actually deflect the argument. So don't let people do this to you. And this is what I want to say is, this is something I've learned in my own online interactions. it's so easy to get in like defense mode when people attack you and try to bring you to another issue, or you want to defend yourself to be like, I don't believe that, or I don't think that. The best thing to do is just ignore that. And then and say this. This is my go-to thing to do, is just to say, that's not an argument. And don't respond to it. Just don't respond to the argument. Just say, that's not an argument. Well, maybe my side is terrible on this, but that's not an argument about the point that I made. Has nothing to do with, that doesn't matter. It doesn't prove my point wrong. So that's always the best way to handle arguments. So ad hominem. No, ad hominem is very common. This is just attacking someone's character rather than their argument. And this could show up in different ways at different periods of history and different social groups and situations and just kinds of discussions. This happens, I think, most often today, and this also relates to the genetic fallacy too, but this often happens today when somebody attacks a group identity rather than actually addressing an idea. So, and this is true of all sides, okay? So, of all sides of political, cultural, theological, whatever divides. So, I can give you examples from everybody. One of these, for example, would be that if you make, say, an argument that defends a conservative position and you're a straight white male like myself, then oftentimes the response could be, oh, well, you're just a straight white male, you're privileged, you're whatever, as if that has anything to do with whether your point is right or not, when it doesn't. I mean, you could be an absolutely terrible, miserable human being, but it doesn't mean that you're wrong about whatever you're discussing. And then on the other side, oftentimes I see these discussions on social media again, where someone who's more conservative is going to attack somebody who's more progressive, something that they say on Twitter or wherever, and the response is pronouns in bio, right? So they just say like, well, you've got pronouns in your bio, so obviously you're wrong about something that has nothing to do with that. Well, that's not an argument. So it doesn't matter who's making the argument, who's doing this. Everybody does this right now. And so it's not helpful. And you see this in theological things too, where you're a Protestant like myself, and you're debating somebody who's, say, Roman Catholic, and then they just bring up something that like Luther did and say like, oh, you're a bad person because Martin Luther was a bad person because he did this, and you're this, therefore you're bad. And you're like, it's nothing to do with anything. Okay. So there is a kind of ad hominem fallacy when an interlocutor attacks someone by appealing to stances on all sorts of other unrelated issues. So this happens all the time, and this is related to what I was just talking about, where you might defend a particular position on one issue, and then somebody's going to jump to your position on another issue in order to make you look bad. You have a bad view of this, therefore what you say about this is irrelevant. So, for example, take your position on like social welfare generally, then take your position on, say, gun rights. Well, those two things are not inherently connected to each other. Now, they do have a general connection in terms of political parties in the United States. They don't necessarily in other countries, though. But if you try to respond to, say, somebody's view about even, say, like universal health care by appealing to something that has to do with someone's view of gun rights in one direction or another, it's not relevant. It doesn't matter what view somebody has of this other thing. What you're trying to do is demean them by saying they're part of the side that I don't like. Therefore, if anyone else is reading this, just know they're the bad person because they have this view of this other thing. So therefore, we should engage them on this. That's not an argument. Okay, so this often takes the form of you're part of Group B rather than Group A, and Group B is wrong about other things, so you also must be wrong here. That's a fallacy. And that's also a genetic fallacy, too. So here's an example that I give here, bringing up someone's stances on COVID vaccines or lockdowns, views of gender politics, who someone voted for, when that's not the point at hand at all. I see this thing where people try to argue with somebody who makes a point about whatever political thing, and then they'll go back through their Twitter history, and they will look for something. They'll look up the word vaccine to see what they said about COVID or masks. And so they say, well, the mask mandates were bad, the COVID mandates were bad. Therefore, if I can get a screenshot of something they said about mask mandates and put it here into this conversation that has no relevance whatsoever to that, that means that's a signal to everybody else that they're a bad person, therefore you should listen to them. And that's not an argument. So, okay, the best way to handle this is, as I said, not self-defense. Never do it. Do not engage it. People do this to me all the time. There are things that people say about my person and character that are complete falsehoods, that are just completely made up. And I've never responded to them. Someone asks me in person, I'll tell them that's not true, but it's never brought up as a question. It's just well, you think this, and or you did this, or you're like this. I'm like, I don't want to engage that. So I just ignore it because it's not relevant. I could be a miserable human being. I could be I could be a complete, narcissist, sociopath. I could be a serial killer. But it doesn't mean that whatever philosophical point I bring up is necessarily wrong. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Don't get into self-defense. It's never good. Just ignore it. You don't have to defend yourself. That's just a distraction tactic. And if you want to make a persuasive argument, don't defend yourself. You're not the thing being discussed. Defend the idea or the principle. That's what matters. All right. Then let's see the slippery slope fallacy. Now, this fallacy is one that I think is often mislabeled, but this is when you make an argument based on an extreme hypothetical that is the assumed result of a particular conclusion. And so you might, make a kind of argument that says, well, if you allow this kind of thing to happen, then this other terrible kind of thing is going to happen. Well, if you approve of this, then you're going to also approve of this other thing. And this kind of argumentation can be very persuasive to people because what you're trying to do is present something that is bad, and everyone's going to agree is bad, as the logical next step of a point that somebody else is making. So you're trying to equate these two things to one another. Now, I do want to say this, though, that many things that are accused of being slippery slope fallacies are not really slippery slope fallacies. So, for example, it is not a fallacy to make an argument that is based on first principles which lead to a particular claim if one can demonstrate how those same principles logically necessitate a more extreme position. So if you can demonstrate that, if you're arguing for this particular, say, policy, but if you put this policy in place, it is going to undo all of these other protections, and that therefore it is likely that just out of logical necessity or the thing you are doing, this is a likely result of that, even if unintended. That's not a fallacy to do that. It's a fallacy if you make an absolute connection without demonstrating that these things are inherently linked. Okay. So, for example, what someone might say, well, I believe that rights are not inherent. Someone says, I believe that rights are not inherent. They're just given by government, by society. So your rights are just whatever the government decides your rights are. Well, if you're saying that rights are not inherent to human beings, but there's something that's just given by the government, that also means they could be taken away. And that also means that you could say, take away the right to life from this or that people group if you wanted to. Now, that might sound like a slippery slope fallacy because you're saying, well, you're just saying, well, the inevitable result of this is this. This is way down the road, but nobody's arguing for that. But the argument works because you're saying what the problem is that these are the implications of a false underlying principle. So that kind of argument works. It's not a fallacy. It would be a fallacy if you are making a claim about inevitability, right? If you're saying that if you hold this, this will happen. You don't know that that's going to happen, but you can make an argument that says that this seems to be the implication, or you have broken down all of the barriers for X, Y, or Z to happen. You can make that argument. Okay, appeal to emotion. Though appeals to pathos, as we talked about, are often rhetorically effective, they don't constitute a coherent logical argument. So, for example, if you say your position, the view that you hold is very offensive to person group X, Y, or Z, or it's harmful to group X, Y, or Z, that by itself, that doesn't constitute a logical argument. Something may be offensive to a group of people, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. There are truths that are offensive. There are truths that are not very nice, that we may have wished were not true. So just because something is harmful in some way psychologically, or some say to somebody, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. So that's not an argument. It's not a logical argument. Now, this kind of argument could be made into a logical argument if those who are debating, the debaters here, are agreed to some particular value claim that is perceived as objective. So if you are going to say that harming group X is an inherent evil, that's an objective claim. If you're making that's an objective value claim, and position Y leads to the harming of group X, well, now you're talking about something that is objectively immoral. So you may use a kind of an appeal to emotion that is also drawing on objective value claims, but the appeal to emotion by itself is not a logical argument. False equivalency. false equivalency, this happens all the time. I see this so much, where somebody poses an alternative to their view, which is an extreme alternative, and then gives you the option as if, well, you've got to either agree with this crazy idea or you've got to agree with them, right? So this is when two alternatives are posed as mutually exclusive, as if one person has no choice but to agree to one alternative or the other. So here's an example. Karl Marx was wrong about the redistribution of wealth, so we should abolish the Federal Reserve. So I'm not making a claim about either of these things, to be clear. That doesn't necessarily follow, right? You could be a non-Marxist and still believe that we should have a Federal Reserve. So these two things don't necessarily equate to one another. There are all sorts of positions in between abolishing the Federal Reserve and Marxism. So this kind of thing happens an awful lot, so that the other side looks so bad that you have to agree with somebody because you don't want to be the other side. When in reality, there are all sorts of like gradations of things between two extreme views. Okay, genetic fallacy. I'll just quickly mention this because I feel like I've already mentioned it before with ad hominem, and these aren't necessarily the same, but I feel like there's so much overlap, especially today, in how these things are used, how arguments work. And this is dismissing a view because of its source, right? To say, well, this view comes from this person, and this person is bad, therefore, or this person has wrong ideas about this other thing, therefore we should reject it. Well, that's just not how these kind of things work. Somebody who is wrong about one thing could be very right about another thing. Now, you can, if you're arguing from first principles, if you want to make an argument that, well, the reason why this person came up with this view is based on principles that are false, that also show themselves in their other false views, that's a different kind of argument. But if you are just going to throw out to say, well, Karl Marx said this thing, and Karl Marx is bad, so it must be wrong. Well, not necessarily. Evaluate the claim and say, is it right or wrong? You can't just cite the source and say, because someone who was wrong said it, therefore, it must inherently be wrong. There are all sorts of people with, even wicked people in this world that have been highly intelligent, who have said things that have benefited humanity. And it would have been bad for society to simply throw those kind of things out. Another fallacy is this idea that correlation equals causation. All right, so in reality, correlation does not equal causation necessarily. That has to be proven. So the fact that two events, views, ideas, or trends are strongly correlated does not necessarily mean that they have an inherent causal connection. I'm sorry to have all these typos in these slides. I typed this up quickly, and now I'm seeing them. Okay, so here is just one example of this, and this happens in intellectual history all the time, where the view of one person on some view or some thing happens in history, and you look at something as old and outdated, people tend to just throw out then everything that's related to that what is old and outdated thing, when really they should have just reevaluated and said, what about this thing needed to be corrected? Or what about this idea or thinker was actually wrong and what maybe wasn't wrong? So here's an example of this. When the world moved away from Aristotle's view of science, because Aristotle did write a bit on science. You think of him as a philosopher, but the relation between philosophy and science wasn't like a clear division. I mean, philosophy covered scientific fields. Now, in Aristotle's day, people didn't know nearly as much about the world or the functioning of the universe as they do today. And so people did in the modern world start to move away from Aristotle's view of science. 16th, 17th century, this happens. And started to learn more about the proper functioning of the natural world. And some of Aristotle's scientific hypotheses were proven to be wrong. And when this happened in intellectual history, Aristotle's ideas about all sorts of other things were also thrown out. His ideas about metaphysics, this broader philosophy, his views on ethics. Because they say, well, Aristotle was wrong, so he's outdated, so we get rid of his ideas. Well, this doesn't really work because Aristotle's views of science are not inherently or necessarily connected to his primary metaphysical and ethical claims. Aristotle could very easily be wrong about science, but correct about metaphysics. And arguments have been made. I think Ed Feser is a philosopher who's done a bit on this. He's got a book called Aristotle's Revenge on this. But the basic point is these two things don't necessitate one another. And so just because we threw out one doesn't necessarily mean that that we should throw out the other. And so if you want to say that Aristotle's views of, say, metaphysics are wrong, you can't do that by showing how his views of science are wrong. Then you got to prove in the area of metaphysics how he's wrong on those particular claims, because they're not necessarily consistent with each other. Here's another example of how this works, this correlation. When people say things like, well, liberals believe X and I am a conservative and I reject X, or vice versa, the other way around. So this doesn't work unless you can demonstrate an inherent necessary connection between the ideology of one of those groups and that particular idea. So it doesn't just work as a logical argument to simply say, well, because liberals say this and I'm a conservative, I reject this. Or because conservatives say this and I'm a liberal, I reject this. And it seems more and more both sides of the political divide, in the United States at least, continue to do this kind of thing and often form their theology or their ideology as a response to the other side, rather than actually engaging it as an objective idea. Let's move on. Okay, common errors and more common errors in reasoning. Ad populum, this is where you appeal to how popular a view is. And so this is where you're just using consensus. Well, everybody thinks this. Everybody agrees with this. Therefore, it's right. Well, everybody could be wrong. I mean, there have clearly been times in history where mass consensus was completely wrong about all sorts of things. The other end of this is an appeal to authority, which is a similar kind of thing. So this is not saying, well, this view is held by the most people. Instead, this is saying that, well, those who are authorities or experts have this position. Therefore, this position must be correct. Now, let me clarify here, because I think this is sometimes misunderstood. This doesn't mean that an appeal to authority should never be done in any context. Appeals to authority are good, actually, as secondary forms of argumentation. It can strengthen your argument to say people that are generally trusted have also held to this view. It does not, however, work as a sole argument. So you can't just say, well, say the best scientists all believe X, therefore X is right. That does certainly support an argument, and that's not insignificant, right? But that doesn't necessitate that they're all necessarily right, because, again, there have been times in history that we know where consensus on an issue has been wrong scientifically, and further findings and studies and things like that demonstrate that the consensus was mistaken. So consensus should be taken seriously from those who are experts in a field, but it is not definitive. And so the consensus can be wrong, and oftentimes has been wrong in various fields. An appeal to authority does work, however, if there is a dispute between two people who hold to the infallibility or correctness of some particular authority. So there are places where, an authority can define an issue depending on the kind of standards that people agree on who are debating. So, for example, if there's a debate within the Roman Catholic Church, well, there's a view of within the Roman Catholic Church of authority, which says that if the magisterium declares something to be the case, if the leadership of the church declares something to be the case, then everybody has to submit to it. And so if, say, there was a debate about the bodily assumption of Mary in the Roman Church, people believed it was true, some people believed it wasn't. Okay, 1950, the Pope says, this is a dogma, you have to believe it. Well, then you can appeal to the authority because you've both submitted yourselves to the authority. So now that actually matters. Now, if you're appealing to authority to somebody who doesn't hold to papal authority, well, then it's not going to work. So there are places where appeal to authority might actually be relevant, depending on your field and who it is that you're engaging with. Moral equivalence, this is when you are taking a less significant moral issue and just equating it with a far more significant issue to make it sound way worse. Like, well, what you're really saying is you'd support this crazy thing that obviously nobody supports, and you're like, wait, what? I didn't say that, because it's meant to make you look really bad as if you support something that you don't. Now, you can, though, because, again, this is something that I see misused a lot, and people throw this out, because it's not the same thing as being able to make a logical argument to say the principles of reasoning that you are using to defend this particular moral claim also, if you're going to use those principles consistently, also defend this other really awful moral claim. And so that's a questioning of the base principles that you're using to derive at a particular moral conclusion. So that's not moral equivalence. If you're saying it's the same mode of argument to come here as it is to come here. So I want you to think about the implications of the methodology that you're using to come at moral truth. That's not moral equivalence. That's a completely valid way to discuss these issues. Straw man argument. This is when you misrepresent a position before attacking it. I'm always careful about throwing out the straw man accusation because it's so overused. And there are certain places where like everyone who holds to a certain view, they just accuse everybody of straw manning everything because it's a way out of an argument to say like, well, you just misrepresented my view. It's a straw man. So it's a way to be like, well, I'm just going to dismiss your argument because you misrepresented it. There are misrepresentations of arguments all the time in positions. But disagreeing with somebody's position is not a straw man. I remember a conversation I had one time with someone who's a very, diehard Calvinist. And I've written on issues of, Calvinism, and I came from that background, and I don't think everything about it is, terrible or something, but I'm certainly not a 5-point Calvinist. And I remember having a conversation with somebody where I was discussing this issue, and I was citing sources, and he's like, straw man, everything. And eventually I got to asking this guy, I said, have you ever encountered somebody who disagrees with her view who you don't think held up a straw man? And he said, no. Okay, well, that's a pretty good indication of how this guy's dealing with things. It becomes more of an excuse of if you understood it, of course you'd agree with it because it's so obviously true. Well, that's not a straw man argument. Okay. All right, let's see. Then let's talk about finding the levels of disagreement. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about here. This is something that I think is so essential. This is something that I've talked to my seminary students about, and that I really think that this by itself helps to have so much more clarity in discussions that we have. And unfortunately, so many debates or disagreements just don't even get at first principles. And I'm always one that wants to say, let's get to first principles. What are the first principles that are driving your ideas? Instead of just looking at surface level ideas. Because we do this thing where we want to debate particular topics, and we never actually get to the root of where an actual disagreement lies. Because you might disagree with somebody about a particular topic, but your disagreement might be a lot more fundamental than that basic topic that you're discussing. It might be the grounding under which like all of your beliefs depend. So too often our debates, discussions get nowhere because we don't understand exactly where the disagreement is. So if you have a disagreement with somebody, begin with the specific disagreement, right? So say, you're talking about a moral issue, say you're talking about the issue of euthanasia or something, just throwing an issue out there. And you disagree with somebody else about it. Well, you shouldn't just jump into a debate about euthanasia specifically first. You have to actually break down the assumptions of the other person's position. What are the assumptions, the beliefs, the values that are leading you toward the position that you have? What are the, say, in some positions, think about theology especially, you might ask the question of, well, what are the sources that you're using to derive at this conclusion? And sometimes it might be a different use of sources, a total misalignment because you're drawing on these sources and they're drawing on these sources. And again, you can't really engage in a great conversation if you're not agreed on what sources you're even talking about in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to talk about levels of disagreement, and I'm going to say that there are basically 4 levels. You could break this down further, but I'm simplifying this here. Essentially, basically, there are 4 ways that people can disagree. The first is if you have the most fundamental disagreement, and that is a disagreement about fundamental principles or first principles. This occurs when each side has a completely different underlying philosophy or way of viewing the world. And if you have a completely different underlying philosophy, if you look at the world completely differently than somebody else, you're not going to actually get anywhere if you try to hash out your disagreements. You need to start at first principles. For example, if someone says that they don't believe that the human being, the human mind, actually has the capacity to understand reality. If you are going to say that the human brain actually cannot understand reality outside of itself, the only thing that the human brain tells us is our own experiences. Or someone might even say, I don't actually believe I exist as an individual. I don't believe that individuality is a thing. I don't believe that personhood is a thing. I believe that identity is a social construct and personhood is a social construct. Well, it's pretty hard to get anywhere with any kind of argument when somebody has those assumptions, because that assumption is going to drive everything else that you say. And if you're arguing about the nature of reality with somebody who, for example, just says reality is a social construct, and you don't believe that, well, you're never going to get anywhere about what reality is unless you challenge the basic first principle. Is reality a social construct, or can the mind actually understand reality at all? So those are like basic fundamental philosophical issues. And oftentimes people actually don't understand these. This is something that I try to push people toward doing, is oftentimes people fall into political, social positions without understanding the first principles that actually drive those positions. So there are assumptions that they don't actually know that they have, because they probably don't actually have them, but they're kind of imbibing those assumptions about reality in their expression of a certain ideology without really even recognizing that connection of where that comes from. So you've got to always identify the first principles first. So again, if you talk about like a social constructivist view of humanity, well, it's going to be hard to put that into dialogue with one that is, say, has a very theological approach to humanity, or any kind of realist approach to human nature. So you've got to deal there instead of dealing with issues of like law or rights or something, because, well, that all depends on what you think humanity even is, or if there even is such a thing. Then you have the second kind of disagreement. On top of that is a disagreement about sources. This occurs when two people in a debate are using distinct sources to arrive at a conclusion. You might have, say, if somebody is working on very different like principles of science or something else. But here, my example is from theology, which is, say, for example, someone who's Roman Catholic and someone who's Protestant are debating the subject of purgatory. So that's the specific area of disagreement that they're discussing. But the disagreement is not really about purgatory. It's about something more fundamental than that leads them to different positions on this issue. So then you have to step back and say, okay, before we debate purgatory, we have to define the assumptions of each side. Now, the Roman Catholic assumes that there are two sources of theological authority, Scripture and the tradition of the Roman Church as defined by the Magisterium. The Protestant is going to assume one source of theological authority, and that is Scripture, at least in terms of dogmatic binding authority. So the disagreement here doesn't really lie in the issue of purgatory. That's more of just that's an indication of or a sign of the underlying disagreement. It's really a discussion about authority. That's really the issue. And so this is a disagreement about authoritative sources. What sources are you using to discuss this idea? This can happen in history or in literature when you have sources whose authorship is disputed. So if you are, say, looking at the works of a particular writer, and you have a smaller set of books that you're working with because you don't believe that this author wrote various other books that are attributed to that author, well, then you may come to different conclusions than another, say, scholar who does believe that those are authentic works of that author. And if that scholar is relying at least partially on those other disputed texts, and you're not, you may have different conclusions. And even though you both like the same author, you're relying on a different set of sources to determine what it is that author actually believes or said. So then you've got to identify that area of disagreement and deal with that. Then there are disagreements about the method of interpretation of data. So this is when a distinctive methodology is used on each side regarding how to understand sources or derive truth from various sources. So interpretive methodologies are going to be very distinct here. And this happens in the field of literary studies all the time. And so just take the issue, for example, of authorial intent. Now, there's been a move, since 1960s, 70s with people like Roland Barthes and Derrida, away from this idea that the intentionality, the motives or the beliefs of the author really define what a text is trying to say. And so in a more post-structuralist, postmodern view, when you're looking at a text, you're not really asking the questions of what was the author's context and what did the author actually believe and mean by this or that. Well, if you're looking at a text from that more post-structuralist perspective, or you're looking at a text from the perspective of somebody who says that authorial intent is an essential element of what a text means, and that a text actually has maybe one objective meaning and not an infinite number of meanings, well, you're never going to come to an agreement about what a text means because you have very different ways of looking at a text and deciding what a text means. So here's a theological example that, say two Protestants disagree on the issue of infant baptism, right? They both practice baptism. One baptizes infants, the other doesn't. Say the Paedo-Baptist, or one who baptizes infants, might say, okay, well, there's no explicit text in the Bible that says go baptize your babies, but they use this broader principle, which is often described with the language of good and necessary consequence. So that in order for a doctrine to be affirmed, it doesn't have to be explicit in that the Bible just says this in one verse. Instead, we can accept doctrines that are true of consequence of other texts. Like we can align various truths together and synthesize them and come up with something that's kind of the logical conclusion of a variety of issues that are more explicitly laid out. So this is more of a synthesis here. Now, say that in this discussion, the one who practices credos baptism or believer's baptism takes the position, say, that every Christian practice has to have explicit biblical warrant, like it has to have an explicit command. And therefore, we shouldn't baptize infants because there's no explicit command. Well, then again, you're dealing with a methodological issue. You're not dealing with an issue of how you interpret text. You're dealing with an issue of how do you interpret texts, or how are those texts to be used to derive dogma. So the interlocutors here both agree on the level of authority, which is Scripture, but disagree on the principles that are to be used in deriving truths from that authority. And then the second example shows up in political theory, and thinking again in the United States here specifically, but this is different approaches to the Constitution and how the American Constitution functions. You have, say originalism, you have textualism, living constitutionalism. There's different perspectives, but they're going to have different views on how it is to be interpreted, right? So originalism is going to say that essentially whatever it is that the original authors intended is the sole way that it should be applied in society today. And to those who believe in constitutionalism as a kind of living document would say that, well, we have to be consistent with those broader principles there, but the Constitution itself changes. It changes in the way that it relates to society because society changes. So we have to look at how those principles might be interpreted in a very different context. So we're not stuck with the views that the particular authors had of this or that thing in the Constitution. Okay. So if you disagree on that level when it comes to particulars, you can't just engage the particulars. You need to go back and look at the actual ways of interpretation. Now, to be clear, you can also have levels of disagreement on basic things, but also come to the same conclusion for wildly different reasons. So that's true too. I'm not talking about this here, but that does happen too. And then there are like real issue by issue disagreements, and these are disagreements about a conclusion, right? So these are disagreements that actually speak to specific issues directly. So here is where there are two Protestants, say, who agree about authority, which is Scripture. And they also agree with how that authority is to be used. So they both take the good and necessary consequence principle. But they still disagree over the issue of infant baptism because the disagreement is infant baptism actually true by good and necessary consequence, or is it not? So that's a different disagreement than the disagreement before. Even though they're the same, people come at the same conclusions. In the first one, you're looking at people who come at the same conclusion, or different conclusions from each other, through different principles of interpretation. In the second one, they're identical principles of interpretation, but they're coming to different conclusions using those principles of interpretation. And so that's where you get the specific issues. And the problem is, it's this last part that these are the things that are most clearly differentiated between us and other people, what you believe about particular moral, social, political, theological issue. And so we want to focus on those things, but most often, we're actually dealing with disagreements at another level. Not always, but very often we are. And so that needs to be identified for that conversation to be productive at all. Okay, and then I just have this, just an illustration of this. This is a little kind of triangle that I made here of these four principles. And that is, your fundamental principles on the bottom, and these build on each other, okay? So there are kind of these layers So the first is, what are your fundamental principles? That's going to be the basis for everything else that you believe, or at least it should be. A lot of people are very inconsistent about first principles, and a lot of people don't have a consistent ideology, which is something that you need to be thinking about as well about yourself, as you evaluate, say, am I actually being consistent with my principles when I hold to this or that view? It's a helpful thing to do, to be self-critical. So then we have fundamental principles as the basis. Then we have the sources that are being used that's built on top of that, right? Then we have the interpretation of those sources. And then we have the conclusions that are made. Now, to be clear, these also can influence one another as well, right? So you may, for example, use the same sources but have totally different fundamental principles. So it doesn't maybe always work in this exact way, but it tends to go in this direction. All right, well, that was all I wanted to do today, and I think I got through everything I wanted to do here. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. And I know this is kind of longer, but I felt like it just needed this. There's a lot more I could say about this as well. So hopefully you find this as a little bit of a helpful guide maybe for you as you're thinking through some, how you think and how you engage with ideas and how you engage with other people. And this is the kind of stuff that just takes practice too. I'm not going to say that I always do this perfectly by any means, but these are things that I think we should use to kind of self-evaluate how it is that we engage with other people and engage with arguments, and how it is that we speak to other people. So thanks so much. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your podcast app. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.